Welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into how systems shape belief and how better tools help you see clearly.
Yeah, glad to be back.
So this is a special exploration. We're calling it Crisis in Perception.
Right.
It's where we really examine the hidden architectures and the systemic forces that shape our modern world. And the system we're putting under the microscope today is, well, it's arguably the absolute bedrock of a democratic society.
I mean, it's institutional legitimacy.
Exactly. Institutional legitimacy. Because, look, entire societies will happily tolerate elite authority. We've seen this throughout history, right?
Oh, absolutely. Pretty much everywhere.
People will let an elite class run things as long as that authority appears competent and, crucially, accountable.
Accountable is the key word there.
Right. But what happens when that tacit bargain shatters? What happens when citizens begin to firmly believe that the people running their institutions neither respect them nor represent them?
And that is the exact breaking point we're exploring today. We are looking at what happens to a society when the foundational trust, between the governed and the governing just begins to severely fracture.
It's a massive topic.
It is. So to do this, we're using a very specific lens. Our source material today is a book called Militant Normals.
By Kurt Schlichter, right.
Yeah, Militant Normals, How Regular Americans Are Rebelling Against the Elite. And the book provides this really intense systems-level analysis of a massive cultural and political divide. It's attempting to explain what is really a profound crisis in perception in modern American politics.
Okay, but before we go one step further, we have to pause.
Yeah, we definitely need to lay some ground rules here.
Right, we have to make something absolutely unequivocally clear to you, the listener. The source material we are unpacking today contains highly charged, fiercely partisan language.
Very aggressive political viewpoints.
Very. The author does not pull punches. He uses a lot of colorful, aggressive, and often really insulting language aimed at various political figures, institutions, and specific groups of people.
And our job today isn't to judge those politics.
Exactly. We are not here to take a side.
No. We're not here to endorse the author's specific worldview, and we are certainly not here to validate the insults thrown at either the left or the right. Our goal is strictly to impartially map the architecture of the author's argument.
We're examining this book as a critical artifact.
Right, because we want to understand how a specific, massive group of citizens perceives the system to be broken, and why they feel the people running their institutions hold them in basically utter contempt.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core premise here is actually fascinating when you strip away the immediate political noise.
Yeah, if you look at it strictly from a systems level.
Exactly. The author is basically arguing that the way we categorize political conflict in this country is completely broken. He says we need to completely throw out our old maps.
He argues that the old map is dead. I mean, for decades, if you wanted to understand American politics, you rely on a very simple x-axis.
The left versus right axis.
Exactly. Left versus right. You had Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right. You could plot almost every major political conflict, every policy debate, every cultural skirmish somewhere on that single line.
It was neat.
It's a very neat, orderly way to understand the system. But Schlichter's thesis is that this metric is totally obsolete now. It just no longer explains the chaos we see in the system today.
So, if the left-right axis is dead, what replaces it? How does he redraw the map to explain this current systemic fracture?
The new axis, the one he argues actually dictates the current environment, is elite versus normal.
Elite versus normal.
Yeah. Or you could frame it as establishment versus anti-establishment, or insider versus outsider. But it's a massive paradigm shift.
Because it changes what the fight is even about.
Exactly. It means the primary conflict driving the system is no longer about simple policy differences. It's not primarily a debate about marginal tax rates or the specifics of healthcare policy anymore.
Right.
It is fundamentally about class, culture, and who controls the institutions.
Okay, let's define these two groups then, because the way the source material defines the elite is actually really surprising.
It's not what you'd expect.
No, because if you stop the average person on the street and ask them to define the American elite, they're probably going to point to a billionaire.
Right. They'll think of trust funds.
Trust funds, Ivy League legacy admissions, people flying on private jets to Davos,
The 1%.
Yeah. But Schlichter argues it is absolutely not just about traditional success, massive wealth, or actual tangible eliteness.
The definition in the book is much more insidious from a systemic standpoint.
Yeah.
He argues that elite is not a financial bracket. It is a self-identifying class.
So it's an identity.
Yes. I mean, obviously, it certainly includes the actual institutional managers,
The people actually running things.
right? The people running the federal government, the legacy media, the upper echelons of academia, Hollywood studios, the C-suites of big business. But crucially, the elite also includes anyone who simply chooses to affiliate with their values.
That's the key shift right there.
It is. It's an identity based on adopting a specific worldview. And, as the author forcefully points out, it requires adopting a profound sense of moral superiority over average people.
Wait, walk me through how that actually works in practice. Because how does someone who isn't wealthy or powerful become part of the elite class?
Well, the author uses this really vivid illustration to make this point. He contrasts two hypothetical people. On one hand, you have the CEO of Goldman Sachs.
Okay, obviously elite.
Obviously. This person is elite by any traditional metric wealth, power, access. But on the other hand, you have a 23-year-old barista with a goatee and a knit cap.
Working at a local coffee shop.
Right. Sitting in a coffee shop with an iPad Pro, sipping cruelty-free green tea, and aggressively tweeting at conservatives. In the author's framework, both of these people belong to the exact same class.
But how does that make sense systemically? I mean, a barista making near minimum wage has zero institutional power. They aren't writing legislation.
They aren't green-lighting movies.
Exactly. So how are they the same class?
Because membership in the modern American elite, according to the book, doesn't require actual power or wealth. It requires an affiliation of attitude.
Affiliation of attitude.
Yeah. Joining the elite just requires you to adopt their cultural shibboleths, their vocabulary, their aesthetic, and most importantly, their foundational belief that they are fundamentally better, more enlightened, and smarter than regular folks.
I see. So the barista and the CEO share a unified cultural reality.
And a unified disdain for the people outside of their bubble, yes.
Okay, that brings us to the other side of this new axis. If that is the elite, who exactly are the normals?
The normals are essentially everyone else, but they have specific defining characteristics in this framework. They're the working and middle class. They're the regular Joe.
The people doing the physical work?
Exactly. The people who turn wrenches, work in logistics, run small businesses on Main Street, manage the physical infrastructure of the country.
And culturally.
The source material defines them by their adherence to traditional values, faith, family, and unironic patriotism. They do not view themselves as citizens of the world. They view themselves proudly and specifically as Americans.
So they are defined by their foundational values, but it seems like they are also defined by a negation. Like, they are defined by the fact that they actively do not affiliate with the elite culture.
Precisely. And this isn't just a state of mind. The book points out that this maps physically and geographically onto the country.
With the voting data, right.
Right. He uses voting data from the 2016 election to illustrate this physical divide. He points to Washington, D.C., which he frames as the ultimate concentrated hub of the elite management class.
And D.C. voted, what, over 90% for Clinton?
Nearly 91% for Hillary Clinton. And then he contrasts that with West Virginia, a state heavily populated by blue-collar workers, where elite is practically a dirty word. West Virginia voted nearly 68% for Donald Trump.
Wow. So if you look at those numbers, you are looking at two completely different Americas existing simultaneously within the same borders.
Totally different values, different vocabulary.
And they are fundamentally clashing over who gets to drive the bus. Which brings us back to that tacit bargain we mentioned at the top of the deep dive.
Right.
Because how does a democratic system function when you have two groups that are this polarized?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, democracies, especially large, diverse, complex ones, rely heavily on what the author calls the natural resting state of the normals, a concept called rational apathy.
Let's pause on that term, rational apathy, because apathy usually sounds almost like an oxymoron in a democracy where citizens are supposed to be engaged, right? Why would apathy ever be considered rational?
It's rational because human bandwidth is limited. The average normal American does not want to be obsessed with politics.
Right.
They don't want to spend their evenings dissecting white papers, arguing about abstract social theories, or, monitoring the Federal Reserve.
Or they have lives.
Exactly. They want to focus on their actual tangible lives. They want to go to work, raise their kids, coach Little League, go to church, have a barbecue on the weekend.
And leave the management to someone else.
Yes. They are perfectly happy to cede the day-to-day, boring, bureaucratic management of society to the elites.
It's essentially a delegation of duty. The normals are saying, look, you go do the boring bureaucratic stuff. You sit in the endless committee meetings, and we will build the roads, harvest the food, and live our lives.
That is the tacit bargain. And the conditions of this bargain are very clear. The elites get the prestige. They get the corner offices, the invitations to the galas, the power, and the money.
But in return,
In return, the system demands that they must perform competently. And just as importantly, they must leave the normals relatively undisturbed.
right, they have to deliver.
The elite have to deliver a stable economy, safe streets, functional borders, and competent systems.
So what does this all mean for the system when things go wrong? Because Schlichter's entire thesis seems to rest on the argument that the elite has completely and utterly failed to uphold its side of the bargain.
He is unsparing in his critique here.
Mm.
He calls the current ruling class a meritocracy without merit.
Oof. That is a biting phrase. Let's push on that for a second. Meritocracy without merit. Because in theory, a meritocracy is supposed to legitimize hierarchy by tying authority directly to competence and achievement, right?
Right. The smartest, hardest working people rise to the top and run things efficiently.
That is the public story the system tells about itself. The elite class demands immense reverence from the public based on their academic credentials, their degrees from Harvard or Yale, their prestigious titles.
But the author argues that when you look at their actual track record over the last few decades, it's a catastrophic failure.
What examples does he give?
He points to the hollowing out of the industrial working class, wage stagnation, endless and mismanaged foreign wars, totally dysfunctional federal bureaucracies. The elite claim the authority of merit, but they don't actually produce the results of merit.
And what makes this systemic failure so toxic, according to the book, is the asymmetry of accountability.
Yes, the asymmetry is key.
Because if a system is truly meritocratic, it has to punish failure. If you fail, you lose your position. But the source material argues that in our current system, the elite vigorously protects its own.
The classic example the author points to is the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. You had a class of Wall Street elites who engineered highly complex, abstract financial instruments that ultimately collapsed the global economy.
They wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth.
Largely from the middle class. And what happened to the architects of that collapse? The institutions shielded them. They were bailed out by the federal government.
They kept their bonuses.
Kept their bonuses, kept their vacation homes, and very few faced any real legal consequences.
So the system rushed in to save the managers of the system.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the lived experience of the normals. As the author sharply points out, if a normal American, say, a guy working a blue-collar job in Ohio, misses a couple of payments on his Jeep Wrangler because his hours got cut.
The bank repossesses that Jeep immediately.
Immediately. There is no systemic bailout for the working class. The rules, the harsh penalties of the market, they only apply downward. The elite are insulated from the consequences of their own systemic failures.
I mean, if you are driving to work right now listening to this and you remember the 2008 crash, you understand exactly why that specific systemic failure breeds such deep, lasting resentment.
It completely shatters the illusion of fairness.
Right. But the book argues it goes even further than just incompetence or insulation. It's not just that the elite became bad at their jobs, it's that they morphed from being a caretaker caste into a self-serving guild that actually antagonizes the people they're supposed to serve.
This is a crucial, dangerous shift in the system's architecture. Historically, even if an elite class was somewhat disconnected, they generally viewed the working class as citizens to be managed, or, at worst, ignored.
Let them be.
Right. But the author argues the modern elite actively despises the normals. They don't view the normals' traditional values, things like Judeo-Christian beliefs, gun ownership, strong national pride, as just different lifestyle choices.
How do they view them then?
They view those values as moral failings. They view the normals themselves as an obstacle to progress.
Wow.
In the elite worldview mapped out by the author, the normals are just a collection of bigotries standing in the way of a progressive globalist utopia.
So they see them as a problem to be fixed.
Exactly. And when the ruling class starts viewing the governed class not as fellow citizens to be represented, but as a problematic backward population to be managed, suppressed, and re-educated, the systemic feedback loops become highly unstable.
That brings up a massive systemic question, though, because if these normals make up the majority, or at least a massive plurality of the country, how is this elite minority actually enforcing their will?
That's the question.
They can't possibly outvote the normals on every single issue at the local and state levels.
They don't have to outvote them. They bypass the democratic process entirely through institutional capture.
Okay, let's break that down, because institutional capture is a heavy concept. We are talking about the mechanisms of power here.
The machinery itself.
Right. These institutions, the courts, federal law enforcement, the media, massive multinational corporations, these are supposed to be neutral arbiters. The public story is that they exist to serve the public good impartially.
But the source material argues that these institutions have been systematically weaponized to serve exclusively elite interests and enforce elite cultural values.
Let's look at the specific examples the author provides to map this out, because he starts with the judiciary, right?
Right. From the perspective of the normals, the courts are no longer seen as bodies that simply apply the law as written by the legislature.
Right.
Instead, they are seen as mechanisms for usurping self-governance. If the elite cannot convince the public to vote for a specific policy, they simply find an unelected judge who shares their cultural affiliation to mandate it from the bench.
Can we get a concrete example of that from the book?
The author cites Roe v. Wade as a primary historical example. In the eyes of the normals, this was the ultimate instance of the elite finding rights that were never explicitly written in the Constitution, all in order to bypass the democratic process and impose a moral framework on the entire country.
And the book also points to the pushback against the Second Amendment, specifically citing the Supreme Court's Heller decision.
Yes, Heller is a huge sticking point in the book.
Remind us, for those who don't follow constitutional law closely, what was Heller and why does it matter here?
So, District of Columbia v. Heller was a landmark 2008 Supreme Court case. It explicitly established that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms, unconnected to service in a militia.
Okay, so it was a massive victory for the normals.
Huge.
Yeah.
Because they view gun ownership as a fundamental, non-negotiable right. But the author points out that even after the Supreme Court settled the law, the elite institutions, lower courts, blue state legislatures, the media, they completely refused to accept it.
They just kept fighting it.
Right. Massive institutional pushback. The feeling among the normals is that the elite only respect institutional rules when those rules produce the outcomes the elite want.
If they lose, they just change the game.
Exactly.
And this capture goes far beyond just judges interpreting the law. The book heavily criticizes the enforcement arms of the state, specifically the Department of Justice and the FBI.
It argues that the leadership of these federal agencies, the bureaucratic management layer, prioritizes protecting their own institutional power over everything else.
Over the rights of citizens.
Yes. They protect the power of the elite establishment over the individual civil rights of citizens.
Let's get specific again here. The author explicitly cites the use of FISA warrants. Hold on. What exactly is a FISA warrant, and why is he highlighting it as a weapon against the normals?
Right. So FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Yeah.
It established these secret courts designed specifically to authorize wiretapping and surveillance against foreign spies and international terrorists.
It's an incredibly powerful tool.
Highly secretive, massive leeway because it's supposed to protect national security. But the author argues that the elite management of the FBI turned this ultimate weapon inward.
Inward toward Americans.
Right. He points to the controversies surrounding the 2016 election, arguing that the establishment used these secret intelligence tools to spy on domestic political enemies, specifically people associated with Donald Trump's campaign.
So, to the normals watching this unfold, it looks like the ultimate betrayal. It looks like the deep state utilizing the most secretive, powerful weapons of the federal government not to hunt terrorists, but to destroy anyone who dares to challenge their political control.
Exactly. It confirms all their worst fears about the system. But the author is careful to point out that this institutional capture isn't just limited to the government. It extends deeply into culture and commerce.
It's everywhere.
Elite values are pushed into every single sphere of daily life, making it impossible for the normals to just retreat and live their lives in rational apathy.
This is where it starts to touch the everyday experience of the listener. The author uses a really fascinating example from big business. He talks about a T-Mobile Super Bowl commercial.
Yeah, the cell phone ad.
Why would a cell phone ad be featured in a book about political rebellion?
Because of what the ad represents systemically. The commercial featured this montage of multi-ethnic infants playing to a Nirvana song, and it's overlaid with a voiceover solemnly declaring that the company stands against discrimination and champions diversity.
Now, On its face, a lot of people might say, well, that's a nice message.
Sure.
But Schlichter frames this as deeply antagonistic. Why?
Because he frames it as big business, this massive, faceless corporate monolith, taking it upon itself to lecture everyday normal Americans about morality and racism. The implication in the ad, according to the author, is that the American populace is inherently bigoted and needs a telecom giant to teach them how to be good people.
It's the sheer condescension of it.
Exactly.
It's the feeling of, look, I just want to figure out how much data I get for $50 a month, and suddenly my cell phone provider is delivering a moral sermon to me during a football game.
That condescension is a key friction point.
Hmm.
And Hollywood, which is the ultimate cultural institution, does the exact same thing, often much more viciously.
The book mentions an incredibly specific anecdote involving an article in Scientific American, which, first of all, is supposed to be a science magazine.
Right.
But the author notes that a writer in this magazine called Chris Kyle, the famous American sniper, a child killer.
The author presents this as the ultimate distilled illustration of the elite's disdain.
Break down the systemic dynamic there.
Well, think about it. The normals are the ones who disproportionately send their sons and daughters to the military. They're the ones who fight, bleed, and carry the physical burden of defending the country's interests.
Right.
Meanwhile, the elite cultural institutions, the writers, the academics, the Hollywood producers, they sit back in physical comfort and sneer at those very soldiers, labeling them as psycho killers. The people benefiting from the security are mocking the people providing it.
When you lay it out like that, you can see why the anger is so visceral.
It's deep.
But there is another mechanism the elite use that the author zeroes in on, and it might be the most insidious tool of all. Because when the elite cannot legally ban something they dislike through the courts, and when they can't pass legislation to stop it, they utilize a systemic tool the author calls the power of hassle.
The power of hassle is a brilliant systems concept. It is all about introducing overwhelming friction into lives of your opponents. What the elite cannot make illegal, they make socially, professionally, and practically excruciating.
Let's talk about how this actually functions. We are talking about human resources departments, corporate compliance training, social media terms of service.
It's the bureaucracy of everyday life weaponized. If you express a normal value, say you post a traditional religious view on marriage on your private social media, you might not go to jail.
Right, it's not illegal.
But the power of hassle means you might get called into HR. You might lose your job. You might get banned from your digital public square. You will be socially ostracized by the management class.
And the most potent form of this friction, the tip of the spear, the power of hassle, is the policing of language.
Yes. The author spends considerable time analyzing how terms are deliberately shifted and policed by the elite. He uses the debate over immigration as a prime example.
Okay, let's trace that.
He traces the mandated linguistic shift from the historically and legally accurate term illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants and finally to undocumented workers.
Let's pull that apart. Why does changing illegal to undocumented matter so much from a systems perspective?
As the author points out, the term undocumented fundamentally changes the moral framing of the act. It implies that the situation is merely a minor bureaucratic mix-up. It frames it as, oh, I just forgot my paperwork on the kitchen counter, rather than a deliberate violation of a sovereign nation's border laws.
I see.
And taking it a step further, calling them workers, completely obscures the reality of the situation to fit a preferred elite economic narrative.
So the systemic function of this isn't just about being polite. The author argues this is an Orwellian tool.
Absolutely.
Let's imagine you are a normal citizen at a local town hall meeting, and you want to complain that your local hospital is overwhelmed or your local school budgets are breaking because of a massive influx of illegal immigration.
If you use the legally accurate term illegal alien, the elite management class running the meeting will instantly label you a racist. Your argument is entirely dismissed before you even finish your sentence.
Right, they shut you down completely.
The language policing is designed to obscure reality and compress the range of allowed thought. If you control the vocabulary, you completely control the parameters of the debate.
Because by labeling the legally accurate term a slur, you strip the governed of their ability to even accurately describe the problems they are experiencing in their own communities.
You take away their voice.
It forces the normals into a state of constant self-censorship. And self-censorship is a highly efficient way for a minority elite to maintain control over a majority population. The population just polices itself out of fear of the hassle.
Which leads us to a massive systemic bottleneck.
Yeah.
You have this huge population of normals. They are angry, they feel culturally besieged by their own institutions, and their language is being policed. So where do they turn politically to relieve this pressure?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because for a very long time, the answer was nowhere.
Nowhere at all.
As the author argues, the normals had become political orphans. They looked at the landscape and realized they were completely abandoned by both major political parties.
Let's trace that abandonment historically, starting with the Democrats. Historically, the Democrat Party was proudly, explicitly the party of the working man.
Right.
It represented the factory worker in Michigan, the union member in Pennsylvania, the blue-collar tradesman. Its power base was the physical builders of the country.
But the source material argues that the Democrats consciously and deliberately shifted their allegiance away from that base.
The author argues they became the party of Silicon Valley billionaires, elite academia, coastal urbanites, and what he derisively calls the soft hands.
The soft hands.
Yeah, people who work in abstract knowledge economy jobs. The cultural gap became unbridgeable. A guy who turns wrenches for a living, who hunts on the weekends and goes to a traditional church, simply no longer fits into the cultural framework or the policy goals of the modern Democratic Party.
But, and this is a really critical point in the book, the Republicans weren't any better.
Not at all.
Schlichter is considered a conservative writer, but he relentlessly attacks the Republican establishment. He calls them conservative Inc.
Conservative Inc., the apparatus of think tanks, consultants, and establishment politicians in Washington and New York.
How did they betray the normals?
He argues that the Republican elite loved to fetishize the Main Street worker in their campaign ads. They would put on a flannel shirt, walk through a factory, talk about hard work. But in reality, when it came to actual policy, they catered almost exclusively to massive corporate donors and abstract economic theories.
The author provides a really devastating hypothetical to illustrate this betrayal by the right. Let's walk through the Acme forklift factory analogy because it hits at the very core of this political orphanhood.
Okay, imagine a normal American citizen. He has worked for 18 years at the Acme forklift factory in the Midwest. He's paid his taxes, he's raised his kids, he's played by all the rules the system laid out for him.
Did everything right.
Everything right. One day, the corporate management announces the factory is closing and moving all operations to Tijuana, Mexico to save on labor costs.
So when that worker goes to his elite conservative representative, the guy he voted for, and asks for help, what is the systemic response?
The response from Conservative Inc., it's basically to hand him a white paper. The politician says, well, let me pause you there. According to Milton Friedman of the core principles of free market economics, your specific job in this town is globally inefficient.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, you, your family, and your entire community are economically expendable for the sake of global market efficiency and cheaper consumer goods.
Let's pause for a second. For anyone who didn't take macroeconomics in college, who is Milton Friedman in this context?
Milton Friedman was a Nobel Prize-winning economist. His theories deeply influenced the modern Republican Party. He championed deregulation, privatization, and absolute free trade. The philosophy basically argues that removing barriers to global trade maximizes overall economic wealth, even if it means destroying local domestic industries in the process.
So the elite conservative is basically telling this worker that his entire livelihood being destroyed is actually a good thing for the abstract global economy.
Yep.
It is absolute systemic betrayal. You have the left calling you morally deficient and bigoted for your values, and the right calling you economically expendable for the sake of a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
So you have this massive base of the country just sitting there, seething, with zero political representation. The pressure valve is welded shut.
And this perfectly sets the stage for the massive political eruption of 2016. The conditions were right for an outsider to hijack the system.
Which brings us to the Never Trump movement within the Republican Party. How does the source material view the Republicans who absolutely refuse to support Donald Trump?
The author points to figures like Bill Kristol and other establishment conservative commentators as prime examples of how the elite versus normal divide completely overrides traditional political ideology.
How so?
According to Schlichter, the Never Trump movement proved a vital point. For the elite, protecting their class status was far more important than achieving their stated political goals.
That's a huge accusation. He's saying they didn't actually care about conservative policy.
He argues that elite conservatives were entirely willing to abandon conservative principles and even side with elite liberals because the thought of a crass outsider supported by the unwashed working-class normals taking over their beloved institutions was utterly intolerable.
I see.
They felt more class solidarity with a liberal Ivy League graduate than they did with a conservative pipefitter from Ohio. Class solidarity trumped political ideology.
And Donald Trump, whatever you think of his politics, recognized this massive vacuum perfectly.
He saw it clear as day.
He stepped into the void and became the ultimate instrument for the normals. Now, it's very important to note that the book openly acknowledges the deep irony here.
Oh, massive irony.
Trump was not a normal in his personal life. He was a billionaire who lived in a gold-plated penthouse in Manhattan. He flew in private jets. He was thrice married. He was absolutely not a paragon of traditional Main Street morality.
But the author argues that his personal morality didn't matter to the normals.
Why?
Because Trump possessed two crucial attributes that establishment politicians lacked. First, he built tangible things in the real world. He built skyscrapers, hotels, golf courses. He spoke the language of construction and physical reality, unlike the think tank theorists who only built abstract policies.
And his second attribute?
He fought back. In a political landscape where establishment Republicans traditionally rolled over, apologized, and tried to appease the media or the cultural elite, whatever they were attacked, Trump hit back 10 times harder. He did not care about the power of hassle.
He leaned into
He leaned into it. He was a blunt instrument. The author famously describes him in the book as a giant, walking, talking middle finger to the elite.
He was the brick they threw through the window of the establishment. There is this incredibly memorable anecdote in the book that perfectly captures the psychological dynamic of why so many people voted for him and why the polls totally missed it.
The suburban husband story.
Exactly. Schlichter describes this hypothetical suburban husband.
In this scenario, the husband is married to a highly politically correct, elite-affiliated wife who is aggressively demanding that they both vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016.
And what does the husband do? He doesn't argue with her. He doesn't quote policy papers or try to defend Trump's behavior.
No.
He just nods, quietly walks into the local voting booth, pulls the curtain shut to ensure absolute privacy, and secretly pulls the lever for Donald Trump.
The author presents this as a massive, silent act of rebellion. It wasn't necessarily a deep endorsement of Trump's platform. It was an act of defiance against being constantly managed, lectured, policed, and bossed around by his purported moral and intellectual betters.
It's the one place where the power of hassle disappears. In the privacy of the voting booth, HR can't fire you. Twitter can't ban you. Your elite-affiliated peers can't socially ostracize you. You are free to throw the brick.
That anecdote perfectly illustrates the systemic failure of the elite to read the room. They relied so heavily on social pressure and the threat of excommunication from polite society to maintain control that they completely blinded themselves to the actual resentment brewing beneath the surface.
So we have this massive fracture. The normals have successfully weaponized Donald Trump against the elite in 2016. But the elite, possessing all the institutional power, are absolutely not backing down. This creates a systemic feedback loop of absolute toxic alienation.
To understand the depth of this physical and psychological alienation, the author heavily references Charles Murray's influential sociological book, Coming Apart.
Let's do a deep dive into Murray's data because it's crucial context for the listener to understand how deep the systemic rot goes. What does Coming Apart actually show us?
Murray's book meticulously documents the physical, geographic, and cultural segregation of American society over the last 50 years. Decades ago, the wealthy management class and the working class lived in relatively close geographic proximity.
They mingled.
They watched the same 3 television networks. Their kids often went to the same regional schools or served in the military together. There was a broad, shared cultural baseline.
But today
they inhabit entirely different universes. Murray's data shows the rise of what he calls super zips. Yeah, hyper-wealthy, highly educated ZIP codes. The elites go to the same handful of Ivy League schools, marry each other, move to the same coastal enclaves like Brooklyn or San Francisco or D.C., and consume exclusively curated, elite-approved media. They have geographically sorted themselves out of the daily reality of the rest of the country.
The book points out the practical absurdity of this divide. It notes that most members of the elite class have never done a brake job on a car.
Nope.
They have never fired a rifle. They have likely never been in a physical fistfight. Their hands are literally soft. And conversely, most normals have never intentionally drank kombucha or attended a foreign policy seminar at a think tank or put on a knitted protest hat to march in a city square.
There is zero mutual familiarity. They are strangers sharing a landmass. And human nature, backed up by historical precedent, dictates that when two groups share a geographic nation but have absolutely no shared cultural reality, no shared values, and no interpersonal contact, it inevitably breeds deep, visceral contempt.
This mutual contempt perfectly explains the intense, almost hysterical elite reaction to Trump's victory, which we can analyze through the lens of the normalized debate.
Right. Immediately after the 2016 election, there was a massive coordinated push within elite media and institutional circles to ensure that Donald Trump was never, under any circumstances, normalized.
The public story was that they couldn't normalize him because of his vulgarity, his Twitter habits, or his break from presidential decorum.
But the source material argues that the refusal to normalize him was much deeper and far more systemic than just being offended by his tweets. It was the elite fundamentally refusing to accept that the normals have the moral right to exercise power or to govern themselves.
The implication is that if you admit Trump is a legitimate president, you are forced to admit that the people who voted for him have legitimate grievances that the system failed to address. And the elite, protective of their self-image as benevolent meritocrats, simply cannot do that.
The book describes the intense bureaucratic resistance inside the federal government to illustrate this. It cites stories of EPA bureaucrats, career civil servants, literally weeping in their offices over the rollback of environmental regulations during the Trump administration.
Now, the elite press framed those tears as the noble sorrow of dedicated public servants mourning the loss of vital environmental protections.
But Schlichter frames it completely differently. He analyzes it as the outrage and shock of an entitled management class throwing a tantrum because their absolute control was finally being questioned by the very people they allegedly serve.
Wow.
It is the sheer psychological shock of the servant looking at the master and saying no. They were weeping for their loss of unmitigated power.
Which brings us to a very dangerous precipice in this systemic analysis. When a society's institutions lose their perceived legitimacy among half the population, and the ruling class refuses to recognize the democratic will of that populace, the system begins to run out of peaceful pressure valves.
We are entering the endgame of the book's thesis, and Schlichter's warning here is incredibly dark.
Where does this system go when those pressure valves are permanently shut off?
He posits that because the elite despise the normals so thoroughly, they are actively abandoning the core premise of representative democracy itself.
Which is the consent of the governed, the idea that authority only derives from the permission of the people.
Exactly. The author warns that the elite are replacing the consent of the governed with the rule of power. By continually using institutional capture to bypass voters, they're essentially sending a message to the normals.
What's the message?
We do not care what you vote for. We control the courts, we control the FBI, we control the media, and we control the corporations. We will impose our cultural and political will upon you, regardless of your democratic choices.
To understand the gravity of that shift, we have to look at the historical analogy the author uses to warn against this path. It is chilling. He points to the ruins of Serb villages in Kosovo.
What's fascinating here is that he notes the conflict in the Balkans has deep ethnic and historical roots going back centuries, but he extracts a very specific systemic lesson for modern America. The lesson is about what happens when one group decides to just toss out the rule of law because they find the rights of another group inconvenient.
Walk me through how he applies that to the elite-normal dynamic.
In the 1990s, the Serbs used their institutional and military power to brutally oppress the Kosovar Albanians, entirely ignoring laws, democratic rights, and basic human rights. They relied purely on raw power.
Right.
But, as the author points out, karma in geopolitics can brutally reverse the dynamic. The tables eventually turned, NATO intervened, the power dynamic flipped, and eventually it was the Serbs who were driven out, their homes and villages left in smoldering ruins.
The warning to the American elite is explicit. If you change the rules to rely purely on raw power instead of democratic consensus, just be sure you're good to go with playing by those new rules when the pendulum swings back.
Because if the elite continually use their institutional power to strip normals of their rights and silence them, They are setting a permanent precedent that raw power is the only thing that matters in the system. And if the system breaks down and comes down purely to raw physical power, the elite are at a massive numerical and practical disadvantage.
Which leads directly into one of the most controversial but systemically important analyses in the book, the role of the Second Amendment.
In this analytical framework, the elite's intense, singular hatred of the Second Amendment is not fundamentally about public safety, hunting, or crime statistics.
If it's not about safety, what is it about?
It's about a monopoly on force. The elite hate the Second Amendment because firearms represent the normal's physical manifestation of power. In a system where the normals feel locked out of the media, the courts, and the boardroom, the Second Amendment is their ultimate tangible veto against a tyrannical elite class.
The author's incredibly blunt about this. He writes, "Power is an AR-15 held by a guy willing to die to accomplish his mission."
It is the ultimate backstop against absolute subjugation. It guarantees that the normals can never be entirely managed or forced into compliance against their will because the physical cost of doing so would be too high for the elite to bear.
And so the book leaves us with a stark, unavoidable choice. A massive fork in the road for the nation. This cold civil war, this crisis in perception, cannot go on forever. The systemic tension is too high.
The author outlines two possible outcomes. Either the elite must look in the mirror, change course, and genuinely begin to respect the basic values, the dignity, and the democratic rights of the people they lead. Or the normals must accept permanent serfdom under a ruling management class that openly hates them.
And given the entire characterization of the normals throughout the book, the fact that they are the people who actually build the cities, harvest the food, maintain the physical power grid, and fight the wars, the author insists they will never, under any circumstances, accept serfdom.
It is an explosive thesis. If we synthesize this entire deep dive, the true crisis in perception mapped out in this source material lies in a massive, currently unbridgeable gap.
Between the narrative and the reality.
Exactly. It is the gap between the public story we tell ourselves, the story of a benevolent, highly educated, meritocratic system operating for the public good, and the harsh, lived experience of everyday citizens who feel they are ruled by a class of contemptuous, insulated, and incompetent managers.
The system's lesson here is profound. When institutional narratives completely lose their credibility with half the population, people don't just stop fighting over specific minor policies like tax reform or healthcare mandates. They start fighting over the system's basic right to exist at all. The conflict shifts from political to existential.
Exactly. When the legitimacy narrative collapses, citizens stop evaluating policies within the system, and they begin questioning the system itself.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you watch the news, scroll through social media, or listen to political debates tomorrow. If our society's institutions rely almost entirely on a shared, invisible belief in their legitimacy to function peacefully without the use of raw physical force, what exactly replaces that belief once the narrative permanently splits in two? Can a complex, modern nation actually survive when its managers and its builders no longer speak the same language, no longer share the same physical reality, and no longer view each other as legitimate citizens?
It's the defining question of our time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the systems shaping our world.
Always a pleasure.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help you see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
And if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.